Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Black Minds Matter Exploring Trauma, Dispelling Stigmas, and Promoting Wellness. I'm Dr. Medell Briggs Melanson, Interim Chief of Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the UCLA Hospital and Clinic System. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we wait for more of our guests to enter the Zoom meeting, I'm going to go over a few programming notes and let you know what you can expect over the next 90 minutes. All of our program attendees have been placed on mute. However, you will be able to ask questions via the Q&A chat box down below. Please include your name if you would like to ask your question by your name, or you can also submit your question anonymously and our moderator will read it for you. The Q&A section will start immediately following the panel. Also, you can also upvote a question that you like by hitting the thumbs up icon next to the question. We also want to make sure that everyone is well aware that this program will be recorded and the video will be available for you soon. So during the next 90 minutes, we'll discuss various aspects regarding the status of mental health in the Black community, current stressors, and resources to address all of these issues. All right, it looks as if we have enough people who have logged in, so let's go ahead and officially start the program. Again, I'm Dr. Medell Briggs Melanson, Interim Chief for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the UCLA Hospital System, as well as an Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine. And welcome to our program this evening, where Black Minds Matter. Now, as a land-grant institution, UCLA Health acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielina Tongva peoples. We pay respect to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. All right, so let's go ahead and jump on in. The first thing that I would like to do, and which I have the honor, is introducing today's moderator, Dr. Erica Bath. Dr. Bath is the Director of Child Forensic Services, as well as an Associate Professor at the Department of Psychiatry in the David Geffen School of Medicine, where she also serves as the Vice Chair for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, also for the department. Dr. Bath, I will turn this on over to you in order to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Medell. I am thrilled to be here and thrilled that Black minds are going to be centered in today's discussion. We have a wonderful panel, and I'll start by introducing all of them. So we have Dr. Curly Bonds. Dr. Bonds is a board-certified adult psychiatrist with extensive experience in a variety of clinical, academic, and research settings. He oversees all clinical practices for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health in his role as Chief Medical Officer. Prior to his current position, he was the Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine at the Charles R. Drew University School of Medicine in Los Angeles and the Medical Director for D.D. Hirsch Mental Health Services. His areas of expertise include healthcare disparities, cross-cultural psychiatry, psychosomatic medicine, and collaborative healthcare. Dr. Bonds is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a fellow of the American Academy of Consult Liaison Psychiatry. He is a past president of the Southern California Psychiatric Society and the recipient of their 2018 Distinguished Service Award. He completed his bachelor's in sociology at Emory and earned his MD from Indiana University. Dr. Nicole Green currently serves as the executive director of the UCLA Counseling and Psychological Services, also known as CAPS, the Campus Assault Resources and Education Program, which provides sexual harassment and sexual violence prevention and advocacy services, and the Resilience in Your Student Experience Center, also known as RISE, which provides mental health and well-being education and prevention services for students. Dr. Green is a counseling psychologist who received her PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Southern California. She received her master's in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education and her BA in psychology from UCLA. Dr. Derek Novosek offers expertise in evidence-based treatments for anxiety, mood disorders, and family therapy. He practices a collaborative and strengths-based approach that integrates sociocultural factors as appropriate and in line with his notable research on this topic, including his most recent peer-reviewed paper, Mental Health Ramifications of the COVID-19 Pandemic for Black Americans. Last but not least, our OG, Dr. Gail Wyatt, a clinical psychologist who is a board certified sex therapist and professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior at UCLA. She directs the Center for Culture, Trauma, and Mental Health Disparities and the Sexual Health Programs. Dr. Wyatt has published well over 250 publications, written 6 books, and has provided congressional testimony 10 times. Stolen Women, Reclaiming Our Sexuality, Taking Back Our Lives by Wiley and Sons is a bestseller that details the effects of slavery and oppression on African American women today. Dr. Wyatt guest edited the May 2017 issue of Psychological Trauma, Theory, Research, Policy, and Planning, including research conducted by first authored South Africans of color. So we have an amazing panel. We are going to really dive deep and start from talking about the status of mental health in the Black community. I'm going to have Dr. Curly Bonds kick us off with that. Then we will look at key predictors of mental health and illness. We'll talk about identifying mental illness and then talk about prevention. We look forward to your questions, and without further ado, Dr. Bonds.
Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me to join you and Gail and others that I've recently met and some that I've known for quite a while. So as the Chief Medical Officer for our county health department, mental health department, I've seen a lot. And African Americans make up a great number of our clients that we work with. We are the largest public mental health system in the country. We serve about 250,000 people a year. And of those, probably somewhere around 8% are African American. That represents about what it is in LA. Black Americans are not a monolith. I'd say across the country, we make up about 13% of the population, but certainly when you come to public mental health systems, sometimes that number increases because there are issues like poverty and underemployment and incarceration that leads people to be more in the public sector system than in other systems. So when we boil it down to the numbers, just to give a little bit of information about LA, when we look at our underserved cultural communities, about 835,500 people are African American that seek services or that are eligible for services with us. And a fair number of those folks are immigrants. And I would have to say that even though we do a great job of reaching these different communities, it's probably an underrepresentation of who actually needs care. Certainly, African Americans have rates of mental illness that are about the same as white counterparts. But what we see is that because of longstanding historical issues like trauma, poverty, incarceration, that the stress of mental illness on this community is much greater than some others. And as a Black American, I have to say that just being alive and making it through the day can feel like an accomplishment. And certainly during the pandemic, we've all seen a bright light shown on some of the healthcare disparities. The few things that I'll mention before I leave it to others that won't be a surprise for any of those of us on this panel, and for many of our listeners, are that rates of poverty are higher in Black Americans. About 1 in 5 Black Americans lives in poverty, which is about 2 times higher than others, or in terms of stress and reported psychological distress. If you live in poverty, you're twice as likely to have stress. More households are led by a single parent. Often that parent is mom. And not to do any discredit, because the Black mother is, I think well known for being able to do a great job, but I think it's not as easy as when you have a 2-parent household, which is the case with white Americans. Rate of incarceration is much higher amongst Black men, especially being about 6 times greater than whites. And there are a lot of negative things that I'm sure we'll get into, like the negative effects of microaggressions, racism, abject discrimination, and rejection that can have its toll in terms of just what our health is reacting to, not just our mental health, but even our physical health. And we know that there are physical health disparities amongst African Americans. I'll end on just the note of stigma. that as a community, Black people have not come to the same place that our peers have in terms of accepting mental health as a need, as a health issue, and not as a weakness or a spiritual failing. I think there's a tendency to feel like if I admit that I have depression, that it's admitting that I have a weakness, or that it's somehow that I'm not close enough to my God. And I think overcoming that, while Christianity can be an enormous support, it can also get in the way. So that's kind of the state in just a nutshell of where we are.
Wonderful. Derek, you're going to let us know about key predictors of mental health and illness.
Yeah, thank you for starting that off, Dr. Bonds. I think it's important to kind of put into context where we are. We're living in a time of unprecedented challenges now more than ever. Mental health really needs to be centered in all of our lives. And we know 2020 and even 2021 already, although we're only a month and not even a half in, have brought a lot of stressors for all of us, but especially for Black communities and Black families. We know that the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the ongoing fight for racial justice, and the loss of so many great Black icons in the past year occur against a backdrop of systemic inequities in pretty much all aspects of society. And in terms of thinking about mental health in the Black community, it's important to think about stress, trauma, and discrimination, which we know are all associated with increased mental health needs. And there are so many systemic inequities and barriers that Black Americans face that can increase risk for emotional distress. And particularly thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, these stressors might look like unemployment, job loss, unsafe or risky work conditions, social isolation, death of loved ones, sickness, financial uncertainty, domestic or sexual violence, and loss of housing. And when we think about trauma, there's a lot to unpack with the trauma, racial trauma in the pandemic, from healthcare workers, from the essential workers who are on the front lines, who are, disproportionately of color. It's racial trauma in particular is often overlooked. And I think vicarious racial trauma as well. We all saw kind of the Black Americans who were unjustly killed last year on social media, on television, and that has an impact on our mental health, the toll that takes. And so these are just some of the factors that I wanted to kind of highlight as we start this conversation.
Okay. Gail, you're going to talk to us a little bit about identifying mental illness. Gail, you're muted.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you to my fellow panelists, some of whom I've known to forever, feel I've raised, and others that are brand new. It's a wonderful opportunity to share this time with you, and a wonderful opportunity to be on a panel with some Black men. I can't tell you what it means in terms of my feelings of empowerment to know that in order for me to be where I am, I don't have to overlook anybody in my own group, and that Black men and Black women need to be lifted up in these kinds of settings and given a voice in these times. So I'm happy that both of you, Derek and Curly, are here to speak from a perspective that I think we don't hear enough of when we're talking about mental health. It feels alone so many times to be in a setting where we're talking about mental health, because for Black people, mental health has already been prescribed for us. It's already been defined. There were unusual terms during slavery and the years of Jim Crow and on in the most oppressive years that described what mental health was supposed to be for Black people. And it wasn't the same as for other people because we were not supposed to cope as poorly as we did with having to be enslaved, left alone and isolated from family, from friends, in languages and cultures that we didn't know, of course, beaten, raped, and tortured to that degree. So to come to a world where mental health was not allowed for your people means we have decades and generations of people who deny their own mental health, who don't know what it is, who wouldn't admit it if they knew it, and don't want to do anything about it. So that's really an uphill climb, because what we're talking about is trying to go back first, teaching people history so they understand, where did all of this confusion about Black mental health come from? Why is it there? Why is it so difficult to admit when you have something going on in your mind, something going on in your thoughts that troubles you every day, that you can't get away from, that you can't stop thinking about, that invades your sleep, it invades your social interactions and isolates you? Those are all signs that could indicate that you're struggling, that you're distressed. And yet these are simple signs that so many Black people deny and attribute to something else or someone else. So identifying mental health is a struggle, because even in a therapeutic context, when people sometimes come to you for help, you end up as a professional arguing with them. Yes, that is a problem. You shouldn't overlook this, or you shouldn't overlook that. And I see it so often in people who are employed perhaps and having a difficult time with their job, feeling like they're identified and targeted. And yet when I raise the issue of, well, do you think that someone might be discriminating against you because of your color? They will argue for 5 minutes and say, no, that it can't be that. It is an admission. If you say that someone is discriminating against you because of something you can't wash away and you can't ignore every day, that's a problem that you have got to deal with. And it's enormous in this society because we are a racialized society. To say that we're post-racial is not looking at how we're treated every day. Our ethnicity and the color of our skin can dictate almost everything about our mental health and how we're perceived by other people. So we have to take the responsibility of reclaiming mental health, defining it for ourselves, and being the first ones to want to protect it. Because if you don't have mental health, you don't have health. And if you don't have health, nothing else is going to matter in your life, no matter how much money, where you live, what you do. These are crucial issues in terms of well-being. And that's something that Black people are still struggling with, to be healthy, to have well-being, to know that they belong. That has to begin inside. It has to begin with us. So the struggle is reclaiming your mental health, doing times, me time, where you can identify, how am I doing today? Evaluating it, rating it on a scale of 1 to 10. And when you know you're at 10, which means you're in trouble because you can't sleep, you can't get thoughts out of your mind, you're focusing on something, you're anxious and sweating, all of the signs that let you know your body is saying to you, this is too much for me. You have to be the one to identify, this is happening for me, which means my behavior has to change to accommodate my reality. So that's just the beginning of what I want us to focus on today.
Thank you, Gail. Nicole, can you walk us through prevention?
Yes, thank you. That was really, I think, really helped me, Gail, as you anchored that. And Gail is one of the people that raised me in this field. So I feel really lucky to be on the panel with all of you. I think, as all of us are describing, it's really hard to think about mental health prevention for Black folks because we've been swimming in mud for so long, just trying to get from A to B. The labor of being Black is like really swimming really in mud. And to think about swimming clearly or like in clear water almost feels unattainable for a lot of folks. And even those of us who are doing well, the labor it takes to just look at TV, to look at what's going on with the Capitol and the insurrection and COVID, and watching our people die, and watching the mistreatment of George Floyd, and thinking about all of the people in our family that we've lost, and thinking about the intergenerational trauma that's led to divorce and disease and alcoholism and addiction and poor communication and families that have been torn apart by just generations of assault. So thinking about prevention, what would that even look like? How do we think about taking care of ourselves to be able to swim in more mud? It's a little bit of a catch-22 situation. And so for me, what I think about is, we're asked to hold our breath for a long, long time. We're asked to really do a lot of labor. It takes a lot of toll on ourselves. And I think to Gail's point, this point about the compassion and the reality of that. And sometimes because we're so used to swimming in the mud, we don't even know that we're swimming in it. We think we're swimming in clear water just because it's less muddy than someone else's muddy water, And I would encourage us to think about prevention really starts with the understanding of how much labor that takes psychologically and physically. And it takes us really taking really good care of ourselves, which is really hard to do when you feel so exhausted. You want to eat the wrong things. You don't want to exercise because you're tired from the swimming in the mud. But the very thing that's hard to do is what we need to do in terms of prevention, taking care of our bodies, taking care of drinking water and exercising and eating the right foods is like a really basic needs that many different communities get to take for granted. And we just can't, because our systems are so compromised as is, and the healthcare that treats us is compromised. So we really have to do like radical self-care and radical care of ourselves. I think the next thing is really thinking about what has sustained us through all this mud is doing it together. The community, the love we have for each other, the commitment to each other, even when we fight, the spiritual commitment we have to not letting the mud take us under. And usually it's by holding each other's hand. And I think in this COVID time, that's been particularly hard, because we can't see each other regularly. And when we do, we put ourselves at risk to do it. And then we get more COVID, which causes more challenge. So we take these risks every day to like die by the death of racism and not be around each other, or die by the death of COVID. So it's two really hard decisions, but I encourage us to think about ways we can stay safe with love and belonging and really be connected to each other through phones, through Zoom church services, and all the ways that we can be connected. And, we have to get away from the trauma. There is Black joy. There is a reason we're so resilient. And we do stay focused a lot on the trauma through the social media. We have to take breaks. We have to think about what else we can do to think about our purpose and meaning and mastery and what we do for ourselves and each other and our families, the ways that we stay connected to what's important to us and what we've done so far, as was spoken to. And I think the last point is really detecting when we do feel that fatigue, when we do feel ourselves going under, and how do we reach out for help? How would you even know if you're just so tired and you're swimming? It requires us to take breaks. It requires us to take a moment of silence. It requires meditation. It requires getting outside. It requires rest to then just see, like, how am I doing emotionally? Where's my anxiety? Do I feel hypervigilant, always on edge? Do I feel really shut down and numb? And I think with a lot of Black folks that I've treated in a therapy, to Gail's point, it's more that like, I don't even know how I feel because I'm just surviving. So it does take us as a community to really encourage the prevention and self-care of us taking care of each other and saying, how are you doing? Because sometimes we don't even know. So in terms of prevention, those are all the things like radical self-care, connecting to each other, and being willing to kind of slow down enough to even assess, am I well or not, and finding out what that looks like and reaching out for help. So that's what I think about in terms of prevention and honoring that. Why would we be well? It's not any failure of ours that we're not well, like there's a lot happening.
So Nicole, I love that you are channeling Audre Lorde and Black feminist critical race theory and the need for radical self-care. And I'm wondering, what can structures, institutions do to promote that? We know that the barriers to participating in yoga or meditation are also structured, right? And so if we think about how to re-engineer things, and particularly we have Curly here representing the county, but what sort of investment and programming can help promote wellness and develop Black joy?
Yeah. I mean, I can start us off, but I know other folks have ideas. Like for me, the structures that we've created for ourselves have always been really, really a good start. Like 5 friends committing to doing yoga together online is a good start. For me, the structures often, even when they try, because they don't understand the racism that's being perpetuated. There's a lot of, let's say we take yoga, the body shaming, the ways in which, they're not accommodating to diverse bodies when they have to do yoga poses. It's almost like we need to think about, we need to buy into the health, but not to the systems that shame us. And how can we engage in yoga that's going to be affirming to us and our bodies and all the ways that we show up? And with regard to structures, I do think systems like a UCLA could make time for that. Could think about the labor that Black folks, even like us, that do extra. Can we have more flexible time? Can we really ask for that? To take those times and really force the structures to give us what we need. Because often I think we wait for them to guess and they can't guess. So I think some of it has to do with us really naming what we need and asking for it in community.
That is so important, because what you're talking about is perhaps asking for things that other people aren't asking for, but acknowledging that you need them. As a woman, I know, and I saw my mother cook breakfast, make our lunches and dinner before she was in her classroom at 7:30. She was just an amazing woman. She was a superwoman to me. I couldn't figure out how she did it, taught all day and then came home and helped us with our homework. If that's your model, that means you've got to be a superwoman, but you have to recognize you can't do probably what our ancestors did, nor do we have to do it that way. We have to acknowledge that we have to keep going, but we have to keep learning and evolving as a people. It's not enough just to survive. We need to learn how to thrive. How do you, if you're a working person, if you're in school and class, how do you mix that with relaxation time? Take the kids with you. It has to, and that's something that we're doing now with COVID, because we're required to stay in our own little family groups. And a lot of people have said, gosh, we're having a ball as a family. I wish I could get out of this house. But as a family, we're playing board games and we're playing ping pong and we're doing races around our, where we can, where it's safe, but we're spending more time together. Black people are a we people. And so when we talk about self-care, some people think that's alien and it's selfish and conceited. Some people think you're sedity. Now, only Black people would know what that meant. But see, Curly's laughing. Hey, Derek is laughing. Here goes Nicole. Sedity means you think you're better than somebody else, okay? And you're not supposed to think that way. But I'm saying to you, you are better than somebody else if you take the time to relax, to find ways to let go, decide in yourself, I'm not going to think about that right now. That's the self-talking that we do when we're overwhelmed. Today, I've got 40 problems, but I'm going to deal with these 5 because that's what I can do and feel good about myself. Stick a pen in them, write them down so you don't forget them, but contain your stress so that you don't get overwhelmed with it. You control it. It doesn't control you. So some of the things that we've learned in the past that people did in order to be cool and to seem like they could manage probably need to go. We don't need to do it. We certainly don't need to be people who don't exercise. That's just not going to work. And we certainly don't need to eat so that it tires us out before we even get started. We have enough knowledge now to learn how to live better, a better quality of life. And now we have to do it.
Well, I was laughing, Gail, because I certainly have heard that term. I'm from the deep, deep South on the Gulf Coast. And I think, the term that came to my mind was microaggression, but I think some of them are self-aggressions, actually. We think of ourselves as being different. And I mean, this panel, I'm talking to successful people, as I imagine a lot of people on the chat are. How many times have you thought, well, I can't show up late because I have a childcare issue, or I can't leave a little early because I have a dental appointment, because they're going to look at me differently because I'm a person of color and I need to be setting an example. And I think sometimes the aggressions are we need to be perfect. And one of the questions that I saw in the chat was about the imposter syndrome. I certainly know that there are times when I have felt like, how did I land here in this job? And how are people going to look at me differently if I say something a certain way, or if I do something, or if I dress a certain way? And a lot of that is not a burden that non-Black colleagues carry. And so I think to put some of those things, like Nicole was saying at the door, when you go to the yoga studio and you're going to sweat it all out, think about, what makes you feel good. And I know that for our department, some of the things that we've done, we have flexible work schedules where people can work a 4-day week and have time for themselves on an off day. Now, some people take advantage of that more than others, but I think to make that globally available to everybody at all different ranks, because right now, sometimes it's only for upper management, but I think those types of flexibilities should be expanded to more of the workforce. I know that a while back, the department also purchased licenses for Headspace, which is a meditation app that was available throughout the county for quite a while. There are other products and different health systems make them available, like Calm, where you can actually have structured meditation. And I kind of thought, well, this seems a little heathen to me. I was raised in a Christian family, but meditation doesn't take away from your faith. It just builds time for yourself. And I think so much of what we need to do is to respect and value and honor ourselves, and to realize with that needs to come some self-care.
Yeah, I was also just going to touch on the point of the importance of collective coping. I think as Dr. Green started to also speak about, and that's been a challenge with the pandemic. The church, for example, is a huge source of resilience in the legacy of Black Americans. And that's to some part been taken away, at least the physical ability to gather, but has also been a way that people, have forced people to connect in other ways, in new ways of coping, and kind of getting together with friends and colleagues over Zoom, which there's a lot of fatigue around that, but I think that still is really important. How can we find time to still connect with our friends and family, to not forget the basics, especially during this time when, there's a struggle to differentiate work and life balance, with those of us who are working from home, those of us who may be working more hours, and then those of us who are just really trying to stay above water each and every day. I think it can be really easy to forget about the basics, and I think collective coping with friends and family, and peers is really important. And so that's something that I think we just have to remain creative in doing during the pandemic.
I just like to also add, we are an academic institution, and the experience for students has been really a challenge. And, I work on campus where there are a lot of undergrads who didn't get prom, didn't get their last school stuff, didn't get their last sports stuff, didn't get graduation. There are people who are not getting graduations after working really hard to get into UCLA. There are people trying to do masters and doctorates alone in isolation all over the world, in different states and different places. And this COVID pandemic, on top of what we were already dealing with, on top of not fully healing, not just from the George Floyds, but the Trayvons and the folks that came even before that, Philando Castiles, all of that. It's just so much in the last 4 years. I think in the last presidential administration, with all of the different toxic kinds of messaging we got. And, for the students who've been kind of working in this and trying to study and have the perfectionism, have the imposter syndrome, worrying that they're not getting something that other people are probably getting, not knowing who to reach out to, not knowing who's Black in their classes because everybody's got a black box going with their name. Is particularly hard to understand how to navigate an academic institution that's predominantly white, alone in your room and trying to feel the same amount of energy to study and concentrate and stay motivated, and then beating up on themselves for procrastinating. So I just want to kind of name that a lot of these students do this in a lot of secrecy or shame. I should be able to do it more. And then they want to drop out. And I guess I would just say that the importance of us as a community coming together is to say that you're not alone in this, that this is just incredibly hard. I think it's hard to do it as a student. It's hard to do it as a working mom. My dog's running through here. My kids are on Zoom doing what they're doing. People have toddlers. So on top of everything that we're dealing with, I think the impact, the long-term impacts of COVID are just doubling our need to really think about how we have this community care and how we have these dialogues and how there's space for people to talk in these dialogues, because no one else is going to get it, you know? And if your whole house is drowning, like, you need someone to like be able to say, to kind of not be in the space to be able to relate to and communicate with.
So I want to go back to the swimming in mud analogy, metaphor, which I thought was great, and pivot to one of the questions from our audience members who really wanted to know, how would you advise Black students to better manage their mental health during COVID-19 with online learning and the rapid changes we see in media and the news? And we did touch on some things, but really trying to think about student groups specifically and youth.
I'd like to start with, and I know Nicole can handle this because she does it every day, but I'd like to start because I don't think it's just students who need to have a village. I take a lot from my ancestry because they did very well with a lot of things. They survived for one thing, but they didn't just survive, they found joy. And they created joy from the smallest things. I would say to the students, create your village. Find people like you, who you enjoy, who have like goals. If you're a good student, that are good students who want to make it, maybe they have the same career aspirations. They're not, fooling around. They help you to focus and they help you to feel better, and you then give back to them. It has to be reciprocal. It's not all about you. It's about your ability to give. Actually, that's therapeutic, to give. We are a giving people. A lot of people do give all the time and don't know how to receive. It's got to have both in order to interact in this world. So create people that you talk to, even if it's 15 minutes a day and use that as your reinforcement at the end of the day to check in with your group, your posse, your girls, your boys, whoever you want to call them, but they are your village. If you want to go back to our ancestry, they are the people who know you. They know all about your situation. So these are people you trust. They understand your trauma, which we haven't really talked about this panel, but we cannot avoid. We're one of the most highly traumatized people in the world because few people had 401 years of the kind of trauma that we have had. We were not supposed to survive. That was the whole idea of slavery. We were supposed to go away and just let the country, enjoy all the wealth. Well, dang, we didn't. We survived. Now we've got to move ahead ourselves. And what I'm saying is, remember your history, because it will tell you that you need to take some elements of that resilience and put it in your life every day. You're not in a village, create one for yourself. Find a way. If it's 2 people in your village, that's a village. No, if you're not alone, that's a village. And I'm saying you have to work on it. It's not going to happen to you. You have to create it for yourself. What do you think about that, Nicole?
I was going to, go ahead.
Go ahead, Erica. What were you going to say?
I do want to talk about trauma and, racism and then anti-racism. That's been trending, right? Like, I've never used the word racism so much in my life since May. And it's been, in almost every meeting that I've attended, it feels very ego dystonic on some levels to be talking about it in work settings where it's being spoken about by majority members. And so we know that racism has been declared a public health issue by many cities, and there's even new legislation around this. And so in thinking about this and understanding how pervasive it is, and thinking about how stress is so pervasive on Black minds and bodies, should providers be screening and measuring and assessing everyday discrimination? And how can discrimination be more, centralized as part of a wellness checkup as medical providers?
Does
I
anyone
would,
want to handle it? There you go, Derek.
yeah, absolutely. I think we know that racism and discrimination are associated with so many mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, even serious mental illness. And we also know discrimination can contribute to the health disparities that we see in terms of cardiovascular disease. And so if we really want to talk about reducing physical health disparities, reducing mental health disparities, we need to measure the causes. We need to understand what's contributing to them. And, you know, one way of doing that is to include measures of discrimination so healthcare providers can actually understand the patients that they're working with.
Absolutely. I would agree with you, Derek. We have done this kind of research and found that racial discrimination better predicts PTSD symptoms and depression better than child sexual abuse, which I was really surprised about, and all kinds of other violence. These are experiences of trauma that in our current system, we don't even identify as traumatic. This was something that Black people just didn't talk about, even with their therapists. But today we know that they should not be silent about needing to talk about things that bother them. If you have difficulty getting to your therapist's office because someone has said, used a racial slur with you on the way, and then you get in there and you don't even tell your therapist, there's a dimension of you that you're not addressing and they don't even know. So we need to be more forthcoming with saying, these are things that are important to me. This is what I want to talk about. And your therapist needs to be better trained so they know what to do. They know how to ask those questions. And then they know what to do with the response, which for the most part is going to be, yes, I experience it every day. Even at home, I experience it every day.
I was going to just name that, like, if, you know, even in our lives right now, you know, we're kind of pandemic fine, working, the kids are in school, you know, that kind of thing, unless you've got family members who've been sick. But in truth, if you ask me about my racial battle fatigue, I'm worn out.
Mm-hmm.
Worn out, you know, just worn out, wore out, you know, in truth. And it is it like, you know, work, or is it my kids, or is it whatever? It is this constant barrage of everything that's been going on politically, and saying the word racism every day, recalling racial incidents, trying to convince people that racism is real. That is just exhausting, depressing, anxiety provoking. When you see the data on who's getting vaccinated, that is really my racial battle fatigue, who's just tired of Black folks not getting what we deserve, you know, more than it is any other thing. So without assessing that, who would know that? Right. I know Black folks are used to, like, if, you know, people make the assumption that if we're not talking about it, it's not bothering us. And that's just how we've kind of lived in the world. But once you ask us about it, you get a whole new understanding and conceptualization of what's wrong.
And I would argue that it's like many other things in medicine or healthcare, that if you don't measure it, then you don't know how prevalent it is. And we all know that it's there. I used to hear the term either imagined or real. And I think when it comes to racism in this country, we can all confidently say that it's there. The problem is something that Gail alluded to earlier, as to whether or not patients or even providers recognize it, and you as an employee, if you can identify it. Because I can remember a very clear conversation when Gail pointed out something to me when I was in residency training about how I was being treated, but I didn't even allow myself to think, oh, maybe they're racist. Now, what did occur to me is that in a faculty of about 400 people, she and I were kind of the only two people who represented the African-American diaspora on the full-time faculty. And sadly, I don't know that that's changed a great deal since the time that I was there. You know, Gail is kind of holding up the banner, and I'm still keeping my UCLA appointment. But in reality, I think that one of the problems is that so few people in these healthcare areas look like us. 2% of psychiatrists, 2% of psychologists, I think it's about 4% of social workers. And so we can't be the only ones identifying this. So if other people are out there asking the questions, it also gives permission for people to talk about it. And I think it can take insidious forms. Like within our department recently, I had a conversation by email about whether or not we prescribe controlled substances for patients. And I thought, well, you know, that wasn't a question when I worked in Westwood, because you just assumed that if someone had a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, they checked off all the boxes, that then a stimulant was the drug of choice. Well, switch over to the safety net. And here, of course, there are concerns about medications being diverted or people overusing or misusing them. Well, that's a problem in any community, not just in the safety net, but we have tools in place like the CURE system that looks at who's being prescribed what and it being tracked. So, and I think we also now have the knowledge that ADHD doesn't go away at age 18. So why would we be withholding medications for someone just because of the color of their skin or because of the wallet biopsy that we've done at the door? The same medications work in all populations equally. So access to those things. And that's one of the things that, you know, when I approach my job, I look at those opportunities to think, should we fix it? Because it may not be broken to anybody else, but when they look at it through my lens, then they'll understand, and then sort of the conversation changes.
Well, and Curly, what you're saying, I mean, is true. The gap between treatment need and treatment receipt is staggering. And for Black folks, they're less likely to get antidepressants. They're less likely to get psychotherapy. And so, and I think, Derek, you had shared earlier a stat that only 52% of psychologists feel equipped to work with Black patients. And so, thinking about this, I have two questions I want to kick us off. One from an attendee is, how do we distinguish mental illness from trauma response? One. And the second is sort of thinking about the gap in terms of workforce, right? How do we train our majority providers in cultural humility, and how can that show up when they're thinking about racism and discrimination?
I think that first question for me is one that I hear very often from people, because I deal with trauma a lot and studying it. And also in my private practice, I see a lot of people who have extensive histories of trauma. Sometimes people deny that they have been traumatized and will describe to you, which is one thing I always do. I ask them to tell me exactly what has happened to them, and as many of the incidents that they can recall, is that they will recall an incident or a multiple incidents that are just horrendous. And I will ask them, so do you think that that should be an experience to bother you? And the response will often be no. No, my mother experienced worse things than I do, or I have a girlfriend who has a harder time than I do. But people have a hard time admitting their own experiences are traumatic. And that they, just because they may be less than someone else, doesn't mean that they don't need to be paid.
Oops, Gail, you were muted.
Right, we live with trauma. And this is something I think Nicole said earlier. We've been so traumatized, we don't even know it when we experience it. We accommodate it. If you're upset or nervous, then start smoking. Instead of really addressing what is making you feel like there's butterflies in your stomach, or that you have difficulty expressing yourself because all the words are jumbled up and tumbling out, and sometimes they don't make sense. It's because your heart is racing. It's because your throat is dry, but you realize you're having a symptomatic way of your body saying, I can't handle this. Whatever you're thinking or feeling or wherever you are, I'm not comfortable with this. I need to get out of here. Well, that can be considered an anxiety disorder if you experience it all the time. Or it could be in response to something very specific in your world. A person who might look like someone who hurt you, a person who smells, or the room smells like a place you've been that was a harmful place. You have to really break down, what is it that you're responding to, in order to be able to make some differentiation between whether it's a traumatic response or if it's a more consistent mental health related response. But both need to be addressed.
One of our attendees asked this question: can we confidently say mental health therapeutic interventions are culturally congruent to suit people of color? Or is there still a long way to go regarding this? And a footnote that I would add would be that we know 90% of behavioral studies are on what we call weird people, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies, and don't really represent the world as we know it. It represents 12% of the world's population. And so there is a gap between, you know, culturally informed and culturally adapted interventions. And so thinking about that, where do we need to go in terms of cultural congruency and also thinking about cultural humility?
I mean, I can at least just start. I think, are we where we need to be? There's no way. I mean, as you're saying, we're just starting to, like, on a regular basis, understand the extent to which discrimination really impacts us. We're at the point of just understanding that anti-Black racism has a mental health effect on Black people. You know, these are things that are just getting to be revelations to in many parts of the world. And, you know, in my mind, you know, really helping clinicians, as Curly named, we're such a minority that all clinicians have to have some base competency around not just individual racism or interpersonal racism and microaggressions, but structural racism and systemic racism that you can't really see. It's kind of in the air, and it takes a lot of learning and unlearning how any individual has interacted with racism their whole life, whether they've ignored it, denied it, taken it, conscious advantage of it in some ways. And I think that the one and done trainings, while are a good start of providing education and language and fluency, the real work of continued dialogue and how we conceptualize clients and thinking about intervention, I think we are constantly needing to move that ball forward. And I don't know that training programs even today have even gotten that far, speaking to your point. So I just think there's a lot to do. I'm glad we're having the conversations. I'm glad that it's just not the BIPOC folks trying to talk about this in secret spaces around how we're really treating folks of color and what we're really doing to move the ball, and how the whole field needs to really, really study this differently, assess discrimination differently, and really assign who's really well and who's really ill. Because I think the other thing that we forget is that we take on a lot of the symptomatology of racism, but the racism itself is the illness, in my opinion. And so we also have to kind of tease that apart too, you know? So that's my thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of, you know, the one and done trainings. You know, as someone who recently finished my PhD in clinical psychology, I can tell you that it's not really a part of the training even now. It's something, you know, that is talked about either at the end of the semester in a course, or maybe there's a couple of seminars, but it really needs to be something that's, you know, talked about from day one and is integrated into every type of course and training and rotation and supervision experience. There's still, you know, a lot of, you know, discrepancies in terms of which communities people care about, what supervisors actually have the experience and training to be able to train the next generation of healthcare providers. There's got to be a commitment from an institutional level, from a program departmental level, to make this kind of a core component of training and education, both of the students and of the faculty and the supervisors and the people who are responsible for training the current and next generation of providers.
Garrick, I'm so glad that you mentioned training and training of our trainees. Piggybacking on that and thinking about, you know, how many, you know, like not only Black providers are equipped to take care of Black people, and it needs to be an all hands on deck phenomenon, but there is this sort of gap, and there is a notion to just do these sort of one and done trainings. And so what is the institutional mandate, right, for academic medical centers to embed this as part of their DNA?
I would say that a big part of it goes not just to training, but to making sure that the people in training reflect the diversity of the population. I know that David Geffen School of Medicine has done an awful lot of work over the last few years to look at the things that we're legally allowed to. You know, unfortunately in California, you can't use race as an indicator as to who gains admission, but there are proxies for that. For example, if someone has worked and lived and served in a community that is Black and brown, it's more likely that when they graduate, they're going to go back to that community. If someone has hardship financially, they're more likely to maybe be from an environment or a background that represents an underserved group. So you can take those things as proxies, the type of research that people have done, the types of volunteer work that they've done. And I know that at Drew, that's been a long-standing tradition to convince my colleagues at broader campuses that that's really important, because if we're training physicians and other health professionals, psychologists or social workers that don't look like and don't relate to the community, then we're doing a disservice because we're not training for the future. And I think the biggest impressions that we get often in training aren't from the books or from the papers that we read, but from the people that we talk to. Understanding that my classmate has to leave early because they have to take care of an elderly parent, or they have to work an extra job because they don't have their tuition covered. I think that takes people through their lifetime. It's not just training in a book. I guess my last point is that we think that we all need to mentor one. I mean, Gail has pointed out that she was a mentor for some of us. I know, Erica, that's how we met through the APA. You know, so I think these connections, and when my phone rings and it's a young person, I make the time to talk to them, because I feel like if I can have a small role in fostering your decision to come and train in an environment that may not feel the most hospitable, but I think UCLA is beginning to work on some of that with our dean, but I believe we have a long ways to go still, but to make these environments welcoming for people so that we can open the door, and then to make things like scholarships available as well. Because, you know, if you're graduating with $500,000 worth of debt, you're not going to be able to go out and work in the underserved community as well. So I think we also need to make sure that the financial resources are there as well.
Well, black-white wealth gap is real, regardless of whether you have an MD, PhD, or both, right? Thinking about that, one of our panel attendees is asking about imposter syndrome and code switching, and just reflecting on many of our experiences on this panel, being one of the only or the first or isolated. And even if we all know each other, which we do, our numbers are still small in many of our respective units. And so can you speak a little bit about code switching, and maybe even explaining what that is for our audience, as well as how that can play into imposter syndrome and also stereotype threat in managing everyday discrimination?
I'd like to start with letting people know that a lot of this is published in the Journal of Orthopsychiatry that came out last year. It's called Mentoring the Mentors. It's a special issue edited by Carolyn Belcher, who's at Johns Hopkins, and me. And code switching and imposter syndrome are extremely important concepts to understand. If you don't know how to code switch, you will not survive. It is the ability to understand that there are several ways of speaking, dressing, body language, performance on the court, if you're an athlete, in all aspects of any kind of behavior. There are ways that are maybe more threatening or more acceptable than others, and you have to know when you're there which behaviors you should address or you should emulate. If you're at a cocktail party and you come in with beachwear, in other words, you're not code switching. You're not going to the beach. There are many young people today who don't know anything about the fact that there are ways to dress that can make you look as if you understand what the unwritten rules are, and they are discriminated against by their graduate programs because they haven't been in situations where people explain this. This comes from the kind of mentoring that teaches you. It usually comes from families, Black families, who've taught you when you go into stores, you don't touch things because people will assume you're stealing and you'll be arrested. Those used to be the ways in which we were told how to act, how to behave. It was really because our parents were trying to protect us from hostile responses. But today, code switching is equally as important, just to understand there are many different situations in which you are in. And it's really relevant for everyone, but particularly for people who are not white, that to understand perhaps people are responding to the fact that they don't look or speak or act like most other people do. Now, there are some critics of code switching saying you should be who you are at all times, and bless them, they can be that if they want to. But I know I've gotten a lot farther by skipping ahead and figuring out where am I going in this world and what do I need to do to get there, and making it easy on myself not to have to explain why my hair wouldn't stand up or why my hair wouldn't curl why my clothes were a certain way or they weren't. If I want to take on the toll of explaining all that everywhere I go to people who are looking at me, then go for it. If you want to make life easier, decide who you are and the frame in which you want to operate. And you can code switch very naturally in a way that you're comfortable. You don't have to do it for anyone else. The imposter syndrome means you really are afraid you don't belong where you are. And you see this in women. You see this in people who are at the graduate level. You see this at doctors, at DGSOM, who are in school, Phi Beta Kappa, and still worried that somebody's going to tap them on the shoulder, which is what a student told me, and tell them, you're in the wrong room. You don't belong here. You go over there. The kinds of things that people really have experienced is what people who have imposter syndrome think they're going to experience. They don't feel that they deserve what it is they're getting. And this can be a lifelong issue if you don't talk about it in the therapeutic context, if you don't talk about it with your mentors or people who you trust and love to lift you up and put you back and say, yes, you do belong there. Absolutely, you do. Who told you you didn't? And go through that process. Sometimes it takes, no matter where you are, I have to come home. That's my group. And I have to tell what people hear, what happened to me. If I'm feeling like I'm being treated differently, and they can read it sometimes for me better than I can read it, depending on how strong I am or feel. So those two issues are important, but there are many, many others that people need to know about. We want to offer this into mentoring programs at UCLA. It has not been very well received, but these are really critical for a person's success in this world. That's my opinion.
I just want to add to what Gail just said. I think where I see a lot of people struggle is when they get ambivalent about the code switching. Should I be myself? And they beat themselves up because they code switched, and then they're exhausted because when you code switch all day, every day, that's a lot of burden, and like you're watching yourself. And I think some of the things to be mindful of is to give, to kind of, as Gail said, like think through what is my agenda. And it's okay to, have a professional self and, maybe a more personal or intimate self, and not everybody gets all access to you, et cetera. And I think those are developmental things that people learn over time and make decisions about. Some people are like, I'm done code switching. It is what it is. And some people, it's not, it's too hard on them. I think with the imposter syndrome, what I think I see show up for a lot of people, especially younger folks, is, when it's a good thing, they think it's about like, well, people help me or the teacher's nice. And when it's a bad thing, they take it on themselves and they're hard on themselves and mean to themselves. And, or they think like they're so afraid of confirming a stereotype that they actually confirm the stereotype because performance anxiety gets in their way. And so what I see is that people start to then stumble and fumble and get anxious and overwhelmed and doubt themselves. And then they isolate and then they hold secrets. And then they it deters them even more. And they haven't told the truth. They haven't asked for help. They haven't gone to their families and say, this is what's exhausting to me, or I didn't feel like I belong there. And they're holding it in a lot of like isolation and secret. And I think it's okay to feel the bad thing, but then you feel bad, and then you feel bad that no one helps you feel bad. So this is where it goes from a place of a trauma response or a reaction to then it goes into very serious mental illness because it's just day after day, year after year, living like that. And, our illnesses are on a spectrum. And some things are more preventable if you can talk to people and get reality checks and engage and communicate and find mentorship. I really think that's a key part of what Black folks have done to stay well, is find people who can help them navigate the muddy water. They're not doing it alone.
Yeah, I think it's also helpful to recognize imposter syndrome as like a sign of those systemic institutional factors at play. I think a lot of times people can kind of blame themselves. Why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't even feel this way. Like, because you can intellectually tell yourself all of your achievements, but the fact that you still feel it, that disconnect, people can blame themselves. But that's the system at play. And if it can't, originally was designed to keep you out. And if you somehow still got in, then the hope is that then that how it affects your psyche will cause you to either fail or to kind of drop out and take yourself out. And so recognizing that that's what it is and that's what you're experiencing, I think can be really helpful in helping people have maybe a little bit more self-compassion and forgiveness towards themselves, and understanding that it's normal, and in some ways expected that you experience it given all the barriers that are at play.
Thinking about managing stereotype threat, imposter syndrome, particularly in the muddy waters of all the micro and macro aggressions that are constantly assaulting us. How do we promote Black wellness in a work environment that is not ethnically diverse?
I think remembering that you're not supposed to be there. This is a system that is supposed to exclude us. So if you wonder, why am I being excluded? Then you've got to go back in history. You may not have time to do that every time. Just accept the fact. Most places, most things in this world were probably not meant for you. So you have to have that conversation. I'm probably not supposed to be here. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be here because I want to be here. And what I'm going to do is break this down to a village. I'm going to go around this room and work it. I'm going to meet people. I'm going to meet the most friendly people and probably exchange information with them and build me a network out of this room. Because I know these other folks probably aren't quite sure about me. Just don't worry about it. Just do it. Just get active with it and don't let it sink you. Oh, they don't like me. They weren't expecting me. Probably didn't know I was Black. You know how everybody does that. Well, do I sound Black on the phone? I must not have sounded Black this time. So, and this happens with a lot of people who are in professional worlds. People are kind of shocked when you walk through the door for the first time and on Zoom, there's a clear 30-second gap between people trying to adjust to the fact that, oh, you're Black, and they're looking at you like, is this an aberration or are you really Black? Then they kind of get with, oh, hi, yeah, and move on with the conversation. So you got to understand, people don't expect you to be in a situation where you are. That's their problem, not yours. Having trouble with it? Are you having trouble? Did you think this was me? Without saying I'm Black, let them explain it to you. Gosh, there was a whole 30-second gap between you acknowledging me and me getting ready to know you. What's going on? Put it on them. Don't try to accept it and adjust to it. I do that when people will use words and that they're getting ready to say the N word because they're a little tipsy, and they'll say the and then they'll back up a little. I said, were you getting ready to say something that was a racial slur to me? Now, I can only do that on days where I'm feeling really good and powerful about myself. On the days I'm not, I may not say anything. I just get away from those toxic people and go home with people I love and say, so-and-so is getting ready to say a racial slur. I have to really watch that person because the next time I'm with them, I want to see, am I wrong? Am I off? Or is this person kind of teetering with the racism that they're suffering from? Remember what Nicole said, it's the racism that's the problem. It is an illness. It is a societal problem that people don't want to diagnose, they don't want to address, but it lives in our society. It's like a worm. And when you see a worm, what do you do with it? Sit there and pat it on the head? Well, you can, but I don't want to today. I'm going to get it out of my space because I don't have time for the worm.
Smash that worm.
Smash that worm.
I wanted to present something, and certainly, Gail, I would not dare disagree with you, but I want to propose an alternative possibility that there are those spaces, and I think they're fortunately increasing in number, where the fact that you are there represents goodwill and good intentions. And maybe it's affirmative action or maybe it's something else. But I know that in some of the places that I've been, at times people look to me in the room to say, well, what do you think? And then you have to kind of stop yourself first and say, wait a minute, I can't be the voice of Black America. Right. I'm just one African-American psychiatrist who's from a very specific background, and to remind people that I can't speak for the race, but when you can get the opportunity to speak on behalf of people who aren't represented in the room, you need to take full advantage. And I think sometimes we're trained trained to like bury our light under a bushel. You know, I don't want to make too much noise. I don't want to scare them. You know, I don't want them to see my home self because they won't be able to deal with it. They're going to be frightened. But I think to the extent that you see opportunities where you can make make people recognize what they're doing for what it is and call it what it is, I think that's something that some people don't always feel empowered to do. And I believe that when you get promoted to those positions where you're in those spaces or you get accepted into that program, then it's somehow incumbent upon you to make sure that your voice is heard. And your voice may be a little bit different. You may not always be representing the majority of the minority, but you can represent you and do it in a way that's true and that's faithful to your own beliefs.
Yes.
We say in our community, right, see me, right, and I see you. And so that there's a need to recognize. One of our attendees had the question about being multiracial and that it presents similar but unique challenges for those of us who never truly seem to belong or sometimes be able to be accepted by one larger group. So thinking about our multiracial brothers and sisters, who wants to answer that question?
Well, I guess maybe I'll start. I mean, the country has just changed so much, but, in a lot of ways, I know it forces a choice. If you got one drop, it is what it is. And, but the identity that comes with that is really complex. And when I've worked with folks who are multiracial and trying to figure out where do they fit in, how do they fit in, and trying to find their voice, I do think it's a particular journey that they go on to try to find this. And in truth, I think, at least in the Black community, we've been taught if you're one drop, it is what it is. And we don't generally drop people out, even people that I think need to go, like we just keep them. So I think it's more of an identity. Now luckily we finally made a decision, you gotta go. But there's been some others that I'm like, I don't know, they gotta go. But with regard to folks who are struggling in this multiracial identity, I do think it's really important to explore where they see themselves, how they see themselves, how to live, not denying, but being very clear about where racism really sits. And I know that, colorism in the Black community is as old as time. And the good, the bad, and the ugly, the ways that we're so ambivalent in our own world around light skin and dark skin and identifying with the oppressor and wanting the privilege of white skin, but then feeling isolated from it. I think multiracial folks are now in that fold, but it's not new to our community in any way. And I think it has to do with the folks who are on this journey also recognizing it's not even really about you. For a lot of it in the Black community, it's about our own wrestling with who we've been, who we are, who gets privileged in our community. And they think it's about their individual identity. And it's really about the intergenerational trauma that Black folks have had to deal with, that we're just struggling with it. And then we have inflicted that on folks who are multiracial and we don't know what to do with them. And white folks sure don't know what to do with them, or whoever else is in whatever community. But I would say, as you're on this journey, to recognize, I think it still comes down to recognizing the intergenerational trauma and the way that colorism has deeply, deeply wounded us. Because a lot of the ways that we got shades in the early days was really around rape. We were raped, and we have different colors related to that, different skin tones related to that. And we have Gail's work in Stolen Women really highlights that. We have literal physical legacies related to this. And then you have multiracial folks trying to make sense of it in their own way. And some of it is theirs in their own journey of how they identify and your own identity development. But a lot of it is rooted in really the struggle that Black folks have had and the trauma that we've suffered. So I wouldn't, for the folks that struggle, it's not all their struggle. It's our struggle as a community and where we sit with all this toxicity around color.
And in relationship to being white adjacent, right? I mean, the anti-Blackness is along a sort of prism of white supremacy and white normativity. Derek, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just going to speak to the complexities of maybe some as people who are biracial or multiracial experiencing mixed messaging. It could be from friends, from family, from their environment. You know, like the attendee said, not feeling like they fully fit into either group. And it's because you have experiences that are unique to both groups, and there's that intersection of those identities that I think is really unique and important to think about. And so finding, you know, aspects or finding ways to affirm your multiracial identity, I think is really important.
Mhm.
um, because, you know, from one group of people, you may be hearing something bad about one aspect of your identity, but the other group is telling you something positive. And that's a really tough thing to kind of reconcile alone. But think, you know, that's where therapy might be helpful. It might be helpful to speak to friends and family. Maybe there's someone else who also has a racial identity. But I think the mixed messaging is where a lot of people may struggle with.
There's a question around policies. And so as we think about switching into action, are there any policies that can increase equitable access to mental health support in communities of color? We still lack resources in South LA. And even yesterday's New York Times showed MLK Hospital and just the, you know, disparate outcomes related to COVID. And so let's talk about that in terms of resources. And are there any policies that we can use to champion increasing resources?
I would say absolutely yes. There are spaces that ask for stakeholder input. I know that for us, we have within LA County a very rich tradition of funding from something called the Mental Health Services Act. And through that, the department has set up numerous platforms that look at cultural competency and also different underserved cultural communities. If you go to the DMH website, you can find information about how you can go to these different groups, and they range from African American to LGBT, disability work group. There are all these different groups where we're asking the community for their input. It's not always easy to hear the feedback, but they tell us in places where we could do better. And also sometimes it's about how we can measure things differently. So being a voice, being a community advocate, I think is really important. I also think that when you have complaints, don't just quietly settle away and think that it'll go away because I didn't say anything about it or nothing's going to ever change. I know that now I'm in a position where I can look across our service areas, and one of the projects that we've been working on is trying to make sure that we have equal distribution of our psychiatrists in particular, because they are in short supply. Even though we have about 225 of them, there's some areas that have far more than others. And so with telework, we've had this opportunity to look at how do we equitably distribute psychiatrists so that they all have similar caseloads, they all have similar work days, and that they have equal amounts of work. And that also means that people don't have to wait an inordinate amount of time to get in to see someone. I think you have to really take the data and let that drive the decisions that you make about how you're going to equitably allocate resources. And then in those communities that feel like they don't have access, you know, it's unacceptable to have to wait too long to see a provider. And just because of your zip code or what your resources are, you should still have access. And I think that's why we also have an Office of Consumer and Family Affairs and a patient's rights office, so that when those things are happening, you do need to report them and call them out so that steps can be taken. And lastly, there's the Mental Health Commission, which is a body that meets that's informed by the Board of Supervisors, that they report to them. So for this county, the Board of Supervisors are the governing body, and each service area has a supervisor, and it's important to get their voice, and you have representatives. So to speak through those vehicles and platforms is really important.
Very.
So as we think about and change the narrative and implement these long needed system changes in advancing race equity in mental health care, how will we be able to measure and monitor that mental health is actually improving for the African American community?
I think
You know-
first,
Sorry, go ahead.
is seeing, you know, whether or not Black people, Black Americans are using our services, because there's still an underutilization, right? And there's so many barriers in place, but also, you know, due to mistrust of healthcare providers, cultural insensitivity, a lot of people have bad experiences and they don't seek it out, or they hear a friend or a relative have a bad experience. So I think first seeing, actual data that there's an increase in utilization of health services, mental health services, is the first indicator that something is changing.
Mhm.
I was going to mention the same thing. A lot of times people think if people are in, there's less distress than things are working, but really we haven't even scratched the surface of the problem. And so when you do see an increase in mental health services, I think that that's an indication that people want to go and people feel more comfortable. And I was just going to speak to what Curly had said earlier, and I think one of the other things to remember is that, mental health in general is underfunded and in a critical worldwide crisis in the VA system, in the K through 12 system, in the prison system, in the county system, in the college mental health system. It's really expensive, out of pocket. We live in LA, and it's really just inaccessible in so many ways, in so many different institutions where it's kind of sort of available. So I think, in terms of policy, the legislation around really seeing the pervasiveness of the problem, and that really it's just inaccessible. It's hard in the K through 12 system, where we could really do a lot of good work with students when they're young and been traumatized, or conversations about mental health. They don't get them. Like, we learned from when we're little to brush our teeth and exercise and take care of our physical bodies. But we never learn mental health as a daily practice from when you're little. And really, what does that look like in diverse communities, in Black communities, in brown communities, and in all kinds of communities? And so for me, it feels like policy really needs to recognize the deep underfunding of mental health as part of a health industry, and how inaccessible it is. And it feels like a private practice luxury for most people. And so it's really hard to see how there could be outcome changes if we don't first reckon with that serious issue. And what do we do to really train people and make these pipelines to higher education a lot easier and more tangible for folks of color?
I think we also need to demand from those people who make decisions that our communities, the Black communities, there's not one, by the way. I get so frustrated when I hear people talk about the Black community. There's more diversity within the group than there is out. I think that what we need is someone to recognize that we need services. And I've never seen that kind of priority in any politician who got up and said, what I'm going to do, first thing I'm going to do is create some kind of system where all people can access mental health services. And that this is something that requires, like you're saying, Nicole, an education. You have to be socialized to use mental health services. Many people who come from Compton or Watts, who come up to UCLA, come really, really early. They're used to a system where it's first come, first serve, and not the appointment system. So they may be sitting there all day for a 3 o'clock appointment because they didn't understand from the therapist who made the appointment with them that come half hour early for your appointment, and your appointment is at 3 or something like that, instead of first come, first serve. There are just so many little nuances in the system that need to be explained. People need to also read books. I know B.B. Moore Campbell wrote a book about mental illness years and years ago. She had such courage, and I miss her terribly, but she wrote about mental illness in a Black family and how it was handled and how it was so difficult because there was so little support. I think Curly said it first. When you had a mental illness, it meant you were weak, that something was wrong with you. People don't realize many of these problems are biological, they're chemical imbalances. There can be a balance of those chemicals, and people can learn different behaviors. Mental health is not an exit system. It is an entrance into a part of you that we need to pay attention to. Our mental health should be affected. Look what we've been through. Look like we're going through every single day in this environment, in this culture where we're supposed to have a new president, and we're arguing whether an insurrection was important enough to address. Oh my goodness. All we'd have to do is make all those people Black, and they would handle it. It wouldn't be something that people had to discuss. It's just amazing, the racial inequities that we spend so much time on, but we had a discussion about mental health it would be a short one because people would say, oh, that's too expensive. If we're all crazy, it's not too expensive. We deserve this kind of treatment to be healthy. We've never been healthy as a people. The whole people have never been healthy. Isn't that amazing? We're still trying to achieve health. And to know what that feels like in little children who get so anxious because they want to see their little friends and they can't. And how do you explain that to them after a whole year of those little lives? You know, or people who are so overworked, they don't know what being relaxed means. These are of a lesser degree, but we have a lot of socialization. We have a lot of permission giving, I think, in our community, that it's really okay. And I think this is on a commercial. It's okay to say you're not okay. And if somebody asks you, be true to it. And they'll say, how you doing? Say, not good, not good, but I'm working on it. Maybe that's a way to just admit to yourself, this may not be my day unless I do a little bit more to take care of myself and surround myself, even if it's on Zoom, even if it's on the phone, with people who might say to me, I love you, you're a good person. It sounds like the man who's passed away, I've forgotten his name, who used to deal with
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
I love you, you're a good person, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's exactly what I need some days. You know, guitar, kick your shoes off and let's just chat for a minute.
Well, that helps us pivot to a question around that, seeing that we don't learn self-care as children and our schools are the biggest systemic part of oppression. How can we get schools to integrate tidbits of this, of self-care and radical self-care throughout their curriculums?
I mean, for sure, you know, the education around that and the pipeline and I think we have to acknowledge racism and how much systemic racism and anti-Blackness is in schools. And that the things that they perceive as like, you know, bad behavior with Black boys, they perceive as like active in white boys, like all that craziness. And that Black boys are more likely to go be suspended by the time they're in 5th grade, all of that nonsense. And as opposed to like teaching mindfulness or teaching yoga or teaching kids to take a breath or teaching kids about how to regulate their body and when they're having a bad mood. Instead, we've just assumed the criminalization and the dysfunction of Black people. And we've really made it about less about development and more about dysfunction and disease in Black folks. And until we understand that the education system really does see most Black children as dysfunctional and diseased, they're not going to have a different intervention with them with regard to teaching them about their Black bodies and their Black health and the intergenerational trauma that they've experienced. I mean, there's a way that you treat children differently when you feel like they're sick as opposed to you feel like they're bad.
That's right. I mean, it's like we have to stop coming down hard on the who and start coming down hard on the why.
Right.
And really, yourself, what happened to you today? That's really important. What happened to you today? Not just how you doing.
Yeah, and they're beginning to have these studies about
when
they're putting kids who would otherwise be in detention in mindfulness and meditation and yoga, and the changes in their attitude, the changes in their ability to stop themselves and slow themselves down. And really and truly, I think the marker is that even when we're teaching these things, we're teaching them in a way that like, you little Black boy are going to have a problem, as opposed to, you know, like this system is not for you, like Gail said, so let me teach you how to cope with it. You know, so those are the kinds of ways in which even framing the problem for the student is just really important. And these kinds of interventions, that it really takes all of us as a community to get ourselves educated, educate our parents, educate our community members, educate our policymakers, because we're not all going to be Black, you know, and really start to like change the system. So I'm with you, Erica. Like we've been saying this anti-Blackness word all summer, and I'm like, really? But we got to keep saying it because this is where we can actually start to make some change.
So we have about 1 minute left. There was a question around how do we make anti-racism sustainable? And I maybe want to go around and end with that. And have each of the panelists just give a couple of lines or a word about how to do that. So I'll start with you, Derek.
Yeah, I think first of all, just acknowledging that anti-racism is a practice. It's not like a skill that you can just achieve and kind of be done with it. It's something that's an ongoing practice. I think even for me, you know, it's something that to constantly think about how racism impacts every aspect of my life, how it impacts how I'm treating other people, because we know internalized racism and self-stigma is real, and that affects how we treat other people. And that the work is never really done until we've fully eliminated all of these disparities, all these inequities, which, you know, I would love to see in my lifetime. I don't know if I will, but it just means that the work is never really finished. And it can't be something that just trends, you know, every February during Black History Month, or, you know, at the anniversary of a death of somebody who was killed unjustly by police, or in some other, you know, horrific manner. It has to be something that's ongoing. And I think we also have to hold each other accountable. We have to hold our family accountable. We have to hold our friends accountable, and hold our institutions accountable.
Nicole?
I mean, I agree with Derek. I think, you know, anti-racism as a verb as opposed to a noun, a process as opposed to an outcome. Like, in order for us to do it, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's a constant, it's an undoing of a lot of things. And so for me to make it sustainable, it really is about knowing that it's an ongoing pursuit of how to not just make things anti-racist, but make things just and make things whole for people, and make really toward this world of like equity. So, you know, it's not just the anti-racism, but it's supplanting it with like Black joy and love and those kinds of things.
Hurley.
You know, I think a lot of it has to do with those of us who've got the power and the authority, who are people of color, to continue the conversation, and to empower people who are less empowered than us to speak out on their behalf. Because I think about, you know, our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, who've lost the right to vote because of the new Jim Crow. I think about the people who are living on the streets in LA, who are unsheltered, you know, who can't necessarily go to a politician and say, I deserve housing. We can do that. I think we just have to look at how our country, to so many ways, is based on capitalism. And if we can make it so that people who own the wealth in this country recognize that a rising tide lifts all boats, and to keep repeating that message, that it's good for not just Black people, but it's good for all people. And I think to hold them accountable, those businesses that posted pictures of Black models around June 1st, you know, they need to make sure that they're doing something for the community. And I think we need to support those companies that are making those strides, and to put our dollars away from those companies, or take them away from the ones that aren't.
And Gail.
I would say value yourself. No one loves you more than God and you, for those of you who believe in a higher being. But have compassion and forgiveness. People are going to make a lot of mistakes while we learn what anti-racism really is. And we may not make it, but we can get better every day. And if we are forgiving and willing to keep trying, even those of us who've seen a very different world like I have at my age, know what it really means to be discriminated against. But the compassion is there, the ability to love, and to keep working on it. Let's all do that. Keep working on it.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. You guys were awesome. And thank you, Medell, Angela, our IT team, and UCLA Health for really trying to begin anti-racist praxis and center the margins by featuring, this is the first sort of feature of UCLA Health on Black Minds. So I'm grateful to have this space. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.